Hello and welcome to this session on George Berkely. George Berkely was an Irish bishop and eminent empiricist philosopher whose main philosophical achievement was the theory of empirical idealism or immaterialism, which was summarized by his aphorism, esse est percipi, which means to be is to be perceived. Berkely was born in 1685 in the Kilkenny County, Ireland. Although Berkeley's father was English, George always considered himself Irish. Berkely attended Kilkenny College for several years before going to Trinity College in Dublin in 1700. Berkely completed his master's degree in 1707 and became a senior fellow in 1717. Berkely was ordained as an Anglican priest in 1710, which was common at the time for British academics. Berkely remained at his alma mater until 1724 as both a tutor and a Greek lecturer. For Berkely, the philosopher, things that do not have the ability to think, like ideas, are perceived, and it is the mind, human or divine, that perceives them. Berkeley's theory shows that individuals can only know the sensations and ideas of objects, but not abstractions like matter or general entities. Berkeley's central principle of his philosophy is that ideas do not exist outside of a mind perceiving them. As a result, for Berkeley, it is impossible to conceive of an absolute and independent reality. Esse est percipi, to be is to be perceived. The esse or being of the object is in its percipi or being perceived. Therefore, we can only speak of things to the extent that they are in direct relationship with our mind. While at Trinity College, Berkely also spent time away in London, where he associated with important intellectuals such as the Irish poet and satirist Jonathan Swift, the English essayist and poet Joseph Addison, the Irish essayist and playwright Sir Richard Steele, and the English poet Alexander Pope. George Berkely also visited Europe extensively as he accompanied both Lord Peterborough and cleric St. George Ashe, son of Trinity College Provost, on their continental tours. George Berkely made great contributions to the fields of philosophy, mathematics, and economics. Along with John Locke and David Hume, George Berkely is one of the most famous empiricists. Indeed, Berkely advanced the theory of immaterialism that is widely considered one of the greatest philosophers of the early modern era. Berkeley's most studied works today are an essay towards a new theory of vision in 1709, a treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge 1710, and three dialogues between Hylas and Philonous 1713. Berkeley's work has become increasingly popular since the middle of the 20th century. This is due in part to the fact that George Berkely wrote on many modern issues such as perception, but also, most importantly, the subject of the importance of language. Contributions to philosophy. George Berkely was an immaterialist. He believed that objects were merely collections of ideas and rejected the notion that material things were mind-independent or substances. Berkely argued that when we perceive ordinary objects, a house for example, we perceive only ideas, the idea of house as opposed to the thing house. Therefore, ordinary objects are ideas. To him, the world was made up of nothing but minds and ideas. For example, in his discourse on vision, he explains how one's vision is learned by the perception of touch, which then allows one to judge distance, magnitude, and so forth. The ideas of one sense evolve into the science of ideas of other senses. For Berkely, this is how we construct our understanding of the world, and its application is far-reaching. Based on this argument, scientific constructs are thus disregarded. Newtonian time and space vanish, and time becomes the progression of ideas in individual minds. Mathematics is simplified to a system of science in which words and numerals signify simply words and numerals, and science is a system of natural science. In his An Essay Towards a New Theory of Vision in 1709, Berkeley made a significant contribution to the psychology of vision. This work was meant to demonstrate the manner in which, thanks to sight, we perceive distance, magnitude, and the situation of objects. In Principles of Human Knowledge, Berkeley attacks abstractions. Berkeley wrote his most well-known works while he was at Trinity College. Berkeley began philosophical notebooks, traditionally referred to as philosophical commentaries. They were written in a fairly personal way, for they were never intended for publication. Through doing the critique of René Descartes, Locke, Nicolas Malebranche, Isaac Newton, Thomas Hobbes, and other important thinkers, these commentaries document the early philosophical development of Berkeley's immaterialism and idealism. We must note, however, Berkeley's idealism should not be confused with that of Immanuel Kant or that of G.W.F. Hegel, which are radically different. Berkeley was against transcendental idealism. Kant qualified his own idealism as being transcendental as opposed to what he termed the problematic idealism of Descartes and the dogmatic one of Berkeley. Much later, Edmund Husserl also called his idealism transcendental, albeit in a sense similar but not identical to that of Kant. Transcendental idealism means that there exist beyond the phenomena or representations a priori forms which determine phenomena without being themselves phenomena. These forms are, for Kant, space and time. For Kant et al., transcendentalism adds to these a priori forms, a priori categories of understanding like quality, quantity, relation, and modality, as well as a transcendental subject that accompanies all representations. For Berkeley, however, as for empiricists in general, there are no a priori entities. Everything is empirical and a posteriori. Kant coined the word transcendental precisely to refute empirical idealism. As for the problematic idealism of Descartes, the point was to question the reality of external existence, but to keep as absolute the reality of the thinking subject or the cogito. Empiricists, and thus Berkeley, on the other hand, even doubt the reality of the subject as a permanent thinking substance. There is not, according to them, any cogito or transcendental subject. George Berkely is also against speculative idealism. Hegel argued for an idealism that is speculative as opposed to transcendental. For according to Hegel, the transcendental always indicates a finite and conditioned reason, while speculative reason indicates one that always goes beyond itself and thus becomes infinite and unconditioned. Such idealism, however, has nothing to do with idealism of Berkeley because Hegel makes of no reason an absolute that self-generates itself by facing being. For George Berkely, reason has no sort of reality. It is simply a convenient instrument to express empirical experience. Plato saw things in a related, though ultimately far from identical way. Plato is said to be an idealist because for him there is only reality in ideas and not for things, which according to him are only imperfect copies of the models of the ideas. For Berkeley, it's exactly the opposite. Abstract ideas do not exist. They are only specific ideas which are perceived objects. Berkeley will even challenge the Aristotelian and Lockean abstractionism, namely the notion that you can get general ideas in themselves by erasing the specifics of a singular object. For George Berkely, a general idea is nothing but the convergence of singular objects to which it refers. It does not have its own independent existence, not even as an object of thought. Berkeley is adamant. We do not think of a tree in itself, that is to say, the one tree without any specificities, but the sum of individual trees. In 1712, Berkeley published Passive Obedience, bringing his idealism to moral and political philosophy. As a devoted believer of God, Berkeley felt that materialism was dangerous because it promoted skepticism by questioning the validity of our senses. Berkely thought that materialism also promoted atheism, as it discounts the importance of God, trying to show that the world could run without his assistance. Berkely wrote most of Alciphron, also known as the Minute Philosopher, which defended Christianity against freethinking during that time. Berkely met many prominent American intellectuals. Yet, without the necessary political support for the Bermuda Seminary, they cancelled the project and Berkely and his wife returned to Britain in 1731. Berkely continued his humanitarian work in London, in which he participated in establishing a home for abandoned children. Back in London, Berkely became very busy with his writing. Berkely focused on writing a defense of his earlier work on vision entitled The Theory of Vision, Vindicated and Explained in 1733. Berkely then wrote The Analyst, a discourse addressed to an infidel mathematician in 1734, a cutting critique of the foundations of Newton's calculus. This critical work on the foundations of science would be very influential for the subsequent development of mathematics. Berkely had been made Bishop of Cloyne, Ireland in 1734 and mostly remained there until his retirement in 1752. While in Cloyne, he wrote the most successful book of his lifetime entitled Cyrus in 1744. The work primarily dealt with the medical virtues of tar water as well as the contemplation of God. Berkely later moved to Oxford to oversee the education of his son George, one of his 3 surviving children. Soon after, Berkely died suddenly at the age of 67 on January 14, 1753 in Oxford, and is buried there at Christ Church Cathedral. The city of Berkeley in California was named in George Berkeley's honor. A residential college at Yale University also bears the philosopher's name. Philosophical ideas. Subjective idealism. According to Berkeley, there are only 2 kinds of things: spirits and ideas. Spirits are simple, active beings which produce and perceive ideas. Ideas are passive beings which are produced and perceived. The use of the concepts of spirit and idea is central in Berkeley's philosophy. As used by him, these concepts are difficult to translate into modern terminology. His concept of spirit is close to the concept of conscious subject or of mind, and the concept of idea is close to the concept of sensation or state of mind or conscious experience. Thus, Berkeley denied the existence of matter as a metaphysical substance, but did not deny the existence of physical objects such as apples or mountains. In contrast to ideas, a spirit cannot be perceived. A person's spirit, which perceives ideas, is to be comprehended intuitively by inward feeling or reflection. For Berkeley, we have no direct idea of spirits, although we have good reason to believe in the existence of other spirits, for their existence explains the purposeful regularities we find in experience. This is a solution that Berkeley offers to the problem of other minds. Finally, the order and purposefulness of the whole of our experience of the world, and especially of nature, overwhelms us into believing in the existence of an extremely powerful and intelligent spirit that causes that order. According to Berkeley, reflection on the attributes of that external spirit leads us to identify it with God. Thus, a material thing such as an apple consists of a collection of ideas such as shape, color, taste, physical properties, etc., which are caused in the spirit of humans by the Spirit of God. Theology. A convinced adherent of Christianity, Berkeley believed God to be present as an immediate cause of all our experiences. He did not evade the question of the external source of the diversity of the sense data at the disposal of the human individual. He strove simply to show that the causes of sensations could not be things, because what we call things, and considered without grounds to be something different from our sensations, were built up wholly from sensations. There must consequently be some other external source of the inexhaustible diversity of sensations. The source of our sensations, Berkeley concluded, could only be God. He gave them to man, who had to see in them signs and symbols that carried God's word. Berkeley believed that God is not the distant engineer of Newtonian machinery that in the fullness of time led to the growth of a tree in the university quadrangle. Rather, the perception of the tree is an idea that God's mind has produced in the mind, and the tree continues to exist in the quadrangle when nobody is there, simply because God is an infinite mind that perceives all. The philosophy of David Hume concerning causality and objectivity is an elaboration of another aspect of Berkeley's philosophy. A. Lewis, the most eminent Berkeley scholar of the 20th century, constantly stressed the continuity of Berkeley's philosophy. The fact that Berkeley returned to his major works throughout his life, issuing revised editions with only minor changes, also counts against any theory that attributes to him a significant volte-face. John Locke states that we define an object by its primary and secondary qualities. He takes heat as an example of a secondary quality. If you put one hand in a bucket of cold water and other hand in a bucket of warm water, then put both hands in a bucket of lukewarm water, one of your hands is going to tell you that the water is cold and the other that the water is hot. Locke says that since two different objects, both your hands, perceive the water to be cold and hot, then the heat is not a quality of the water. While Locke used this argument to distinguish primary from secondary qualities, Berkeley extends it to cover primary qualities in the same way. For example, he says that size is not a quality of an object because the size of the object depends on the distance between the observer and the object, or the size of the observer. Since an object is a different size to different observers, then size is not a quality of the object. Berkeley rejects shape with a similar argument and then asks, if neither primary qualities nor secondary qualities are of the object, then how can we say that there is anything more than the qualities we observe? In his essay Towards a New Theory of Vision, Berkeley frequently criticized the views of the optic writers, a title that seems to include Molinex, Wallis, Malebranche, and Descartes. Berkeley argued against the classical scholars of optics by holding that spatial depth as a distance that separates the perceiver from the perceived object is itself invisible. Namely, that space is perceived by experience instead of the senses per se. Berkeley goes on to argue that visual cues, such as the perceived extension or confusion of an object, can only be used to indirectly judge distance, because the viewer learns to associate visual cues with tactile sensations. Berkeley gives the following analogy regarding indirect distance perception. One perceives distance indirectly just as one perceives a person's embarrassment indirectly. When looking at an embarrassed person, we infer indirectly that the person is embarrassed by observing the red color on the person's face. We know through experience that a red face tends to signal embarrassment, as we have learned to associate the two. The question concerning the visibility of space was central to the Renaissance perspective tradition and its reliance on classical optics in the development of pictorial representations of spatial depth. Philosophy of physics. Berkeley argued that forces and gravity, as defined by Newton, constituted occult qualities that expressed nothing distinctly. He held that those who posited something unknown in a body of which they have no idea and which they call the principle of motion are in fact simply stating that the principle of motion is unknown. Therefore, those who affirm that active force action and the principle of motion are really in bodies are adopting an option not based on experience. Forces and gravity existed nowhere in the phenomenal world. On the other hand, if they resided in the category of soul or incorporeal thing, they do not properly belong to physics as a matter. Berkeley thus concluded that forces lay beyond any kind of empirical observation and could not be a part of proper science. He proposed his theory of science as a means to explain motion and matter without reference to the occult qualities of force and gravity. Philosophy of mathematics. In addition to these contributions to philosophy, Berkeley was also very influential in the development of mathematics, although in a rather indirect sense. Berkeley was concerned with mathematics and its philosophical interpretation from the earliest stages of his intellectual life. Berkeley's philosophical commentaries witness to this interest in mathematics. In 1707, Berkeley published 2 treatises on mathematics. In 1734, he published The Analyst, which was subtitled A Discourse Addressed to an Infidel Mathematician, a critique of the calculus. Florian Cajori called this treatise the most spectacular event of the century in the history of British mathematics. Berkeley regarded his criticism of calculus as part of his broader campaign against the religious implication of Newtonian mechanics, as a defense of traditional Christianity against deism, which tends to distance God from his worshippers. Specifically, he observed that both Newtonian and Leibnizian calculus employed infinitesimals, sometimes as positives, non-zero quantities, and other times as a number explicitly equal to 0. Berkeley's key point in his work, The Analyst, was that Newton's calculus lacked rigorous theoretical foundations. Berkeley did not doubt that calculus produced real-world truth. Simple physics experiments could verify that Newton's method did what it claimed to do. The difficulties raised by Berkeley were still present in the work of Cauchy, whose approach to calculus was a combination of infinitesimals and a notion of limit, and were eventually sidestepped by Weierstrass by means of his approach, which eliminated infinitesimals altogether. More recently, Abraham Robinson restored infinitesimal methods in his 1966 book Non-Standard Analysis by showing that they can be used rigorously. Let us summarize what we have discussed so far. George Berkeley, Bishop of Cloyne, was one of the great philosophers of the early modern period. He was a brilliant critic of his predecessors, particularly Descartes, Malebranche, and Locke. He was a talented metaphysician famous for defending idealism, that is, the view that reality consists exclusively of minds and their ideas. Berkeley's system, while it strikes many as counterintuitive, is strong and flexible enough to counter most objections. His most studied works, the treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge, Principles for short, and 3 dialogues between Hylas and Philonous, Dialogues, are beautifully written and dense with the sort of arguments that delight contemporary philosophers. He was also a wide-ranging thinker with interest in religion, which was fundamental to his philosophical motivations, the psychology of vision, mathematics, physics, morals, economics, and medicine. Although many of Berkeley's first readers greeted him with incomprehension, he influenced both Hume and Kant and is much read in our own day. Now you can try to answer the following questions. What are the theological perspectives of George Berkeley? What do you mean by subjective idealism? What are the important works of George Berkeley? How does George Berkeley perceive God and spirituality? What Berkeley argued on gravity as defined by Newton? How does David Hume's ideas and George Berkeley's ideas relate? Hope that you may go through the following reference books for further reading. Berkeley, Critical and Interpretative Essay, edited by C. Turnbane, published by the University of Minnesota Press, 1982. Berkeley's Revolution in Vision, by M. Atherton, published by Cornell University Press in 1990. The Tree in the Cord, by N. Fleming, in the American Philosophical Quarterly in 1985. Berkeley's Master Argument, by A. Gallois, in the Philosophical Review, 1974. Making Sense of Berkeley's Challenge, by E. Seidel, in the History of Philosophy Quarterly, 1993. Berkeley, The Philosophy of Immaterialism, by I. C. Tipton, published by Mithuen and Company Limited, 1974. Ideas and Mechanism, Essays on Early Modern Philosophy, by M. D. Wilson, published by the Princeton University Press, 1999. Thank you for watching this program. We can meet again soon with another topic. Have a nice day.